The people who dismiss your future are often the ones who have never taken the time to understand your purpose. That truth stayed with me for years before I finally understood just how powerful it could become. My name is Ethan Brooks, and for most of my adult life, my family believed I had settled for an ordinary career. They thought I lacked ambition because I never chased flashy job titles or talked about becoming rich before I turned 40. To them, success was something you announced loudly, something people could recognize the moment they heard your position or saw your paycheck. I saw success differently. I believed it was built one decision at a time, often when nobody was paying attention. Unfortunately, the people who knew me best never seemed interested in seeing that side of me. It was my father's 65th birthday when everything began to change, although none of us realized it that evening. My parents had invited the entire family to their home outside Columbus, Ohio. The backyard was filled with laughter, the smell of grilled burgers drifted through the warm summer air, and my mother had decorated the patio with strings of white lights that made the evening feel welcoming and familiar. My older sister Olivia arrived with her husband and 2 children, carrying homemade desserts while everyone exchanged stories about work, vacations, and neighborhood news. For a little while, everything felt peaceful. I genuinely enjoyed these gatherings despite knowing how they usually ended. Eventually, someone always asked about work, and eventually my father always found a way to remind me that he believed I could have accomplished much more with my life. After dinner, we gathered around the large wooden table while my mother served slices of birthday cake. My father leaned back in his chair, smiling as he listened to Olivia describe a recent promotion her husband had received. Everyone congratulated them warmly. Then my father looked toward me. "So, Ethan," he said with an amused smile, "how is that career of yours coming along?" I smiled politely. "Things are going well, Dad." "Still managing operations?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded slowly before laughing. Under his breath, "I have never understood you. You were always smart enough to become an executive somewhere, yet you seem perfectly satisfied staying in the background." Nobody said anything. They had all witnessed conversations like this before. My mother quietly focused on cutting another slice of cake, while Olivia looked down at her plate. I answered calmly, "Someone has to make sure the company actually runs every day." My father waved his hand dismissively. "Come on, Ethan. That sounds nice, but let us be honest. It is a pathetic career for someone with your potential." The word lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Pathetic. Not difficult. Not modest. Not ordinary. Pathetic. My mother immediately frowned. "Richard," she said softly, "that is enough." He shrugged. "I am only telling the truth. I do not want my son waking up at 50 wondering why he spent his best years making someone else successful." I looked at him quietly before answering. "I enjoy what I do." He smiled sympathetically, almost as though I were a child who simply did not know any better. "That is because you have never experienced real success." Nobody spoke for several seconds. The only sounds came from the children laughing in the backyard and the distant chirping of crickets beyond the fence. Years earlier, I might have argued. I might have listed projects I had led, teams I had rebuilt, or problems I had quietly solved inside the company where I worked. But experience had taught me something valuable. People rarely change their minds because they lose an argument. They change when reality quietly replaces their assumptions. I took another sip of iced tea and smiled. Maybe one day we will both understand success the same way. My father chuckled. I certainly hope so. The conversation moved on, although I could still feel the weight of that single word following me through the rest of the evening. When the party finally ended, I hugged my mother, wished my father a happy birthday once again, and drove back toward my apartment. The roads were nearly empty, and the city lights reflected softly across the windshield as I replayed the conversation in my mind. Surprisingly, I did not feel angry. I felt disappointed, but not because of what my father had said. I was disappointed because I knew he genuinely believed it. In his mind, a career only mattered if strangers admired it. He had no idea how much fulfillment I found in helping people succeed without needing my own name in the spotlight. The next morning, I arrived at the manufacturing company where I had worked for nearly 8 years. As senior operations manager, my responsibilities were rarely glamorous. I coordinated production schedules, resolved supply chain issues, supported department managers, and stepped into difficult situations before they became expensive problems. Most employees never noticed when everything worked smoothly, and I considered that a compliment. Quiet efficiency was usually invisible. I spent the day moving between meetings, reviewing production reports, and helping two departments solve a scheduling conflict that could have delayed an important shipment. By the time evening arrived, I was mentally exhausted but deeply satisfied. Before leaving, I checked my email one last time. Among the routine messages sat one I did not recognize. The sender was the executive office of Daniel Harrison, the company's chief executive officer. My first thought was that it had been sent to the wrong person. I opened it slowly. The message was brief. Mr. Brooks, Mr. Harrison would like to meet with you privately tomorrow morning. Please keep this invitation confidential until after your meeting. His executive assistant will contact you shortly with additional details. I read the message 3 times, convinced I had misunderstood something. Then, just as I locked my computer, my phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed a number from the executive floor, a place where employees at my level almost never received direct calls. I answered the call before the second ring, still staring at the email on my computer screen as though it might suddenly disappear. "This is Ethan Brooks," I said. A calm professional voice responded immediately. "Good evening, Mr. Brooks. My name is Melissa Grant, executive assistant to Mr. Daniel Harrison. I am calling to confirm that you received his invitation." I hesitated for only a moment. "Yes, I did, although I honestly assumed it had been sent by mistake." She laughed softly. "I can assure you it was not a mistake. Mr. Harrison specifically requested that you meet with him tomorrow morning at 8:30 in his office. He also asked that our conversation remain confidential until after the meeting." I thanked her, confirmed the time, and ended the call. For several minutes, I simply sat at my desk trying to understand why the chief executive officer of a company employing thousands of people wanted to speak privately with someone like me. I reviewed every major project I had managed during the past year. Had I overlooked an important issue? Was there a serious problem that had somehow reached the executive floor? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Eventually, I shut down my computer and drove home, deciding there was no value in inventing explanations before I had any facts. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The manufacturing campus was already busy. Delivery trucks backed into loading docks, while employees carrying coffee hurried toward their departments. Everything appeared completely normal, and I intended to keep it that way. I greeted the security guard, checked overnight production reports, answered several emails from department supervisors, and met briefly with the warehouse manager about an incoming shipment scheduled for later that week. At exactly 8:25, I walked toward the executive offices for the first time in several months. The receptionist welcomed me politely before asking me to wait in a quiet conference room overlooking the factory floor. Through the large windows, I could see hundreds of employees beginning another ordinary workday. It reminded me why I had always enjoyed operations. Every successful company depended on countless people doing ordinary work with extraordinary consistency. 5 minutes later, Melissa opened the door and smiled warmly. "Mr. Harrison will see you now." Daniel Harrison stood beside the window when I entered his office. He was in his early 60s, dressed simply in a navy suit, without any unnecessary display of status. I had seen him speak during company meetings before, but never in a setting this personal. He walked over, shook my hand firmly, and invited me to sit. "Thank you for coming, Ethan," he said. "I appreciate your discretion." "Of course," I replied. "I have to admit I was surprised by your invitation." He smiled. "I expected you would be." Instead of discussing financial reports or business strategy, he asked about my career. He wanted to know what had attracted me to operations, what I enjoyed most about my work, and which challenges taught me the most. It felt less like an executive interview and more like an honest conversation. After nearly 20 minutes, he leaned back in his chair. "Do you know why I asked you here?" he said. I shook my head. "No, sir. Because I have been paying attention to your work for a long time." I looked at him, unsure whether I had heard correctly. He continued calmly. "Not because you seek attention. In fact, almost the opposite. Whenever our company faced operational problems, your name appeared in reports for solving them. When departments struggled to cooperate, you found practical solutions without creating unnecessary conflict. When projects succeeded, other people usually received the recognition, and you never complained." I listened quietly, uncertain how to respond. "Those things are noticed more often than you realize," he said, "especially by people whose responsibility is to understand how an organization truly functions. Before I could ask another question, he raised one finger gently. "I'm not ready to explain everything today. There is still something I need to confirm." That sentence immediately captured my attention. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Leadership is easiest to demonstrate when people know they are being evaluated," he answered. "The more difficult question is how someone behaves when they believe nobody important is watching." He stood and walked toward the window overlooking the production floor. "Continue doing your work exactly as you always have. Do not tell anyone about this meeting. Do not change your routine. Simply keep leading the way you already do." I nodded slowly. "May I ask one question?" "Certainly. Have I done something wrong?" Daniel Harrison smiled for the first time since I entered the office. "No, Ethan. If anything, you have done something very right." We shook hands once more before I returned to my department. As I stepped back onto the production floor, everything looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Machines operated steadily, supervisors coordinated schedules, and employees focused on their responsibilities. Yet something had changed inside me. Not because I suddenly believed a promotion was coming, but because someone whose judgment carried enormous weight had seen value in work that most people considered invisible. Over the next several days, I deliberately avoided thinking too much about our conversation. There was still too much work to accomplish. One afternoon, a supplier notified us that an important shipment of specialized components would arrive nearly 24 hours late, threatening production for one of our largest customers. Rather than assigning blame, I gathered representatives from purchasing, logistics, production, and quality control into the same conference room. Within 90 minutes, we had redesigned the manufacturing schedule, rearranged staffing, and protected the customer's delivery date without requiring mandatory overtime. When the meeting ended, several department managers thanked one another before returning to work. I quietly erased the whiteboard and left the room without another thought. Later that evening, while walking toward the parking lot, I noticed a black sedan slowly leaving the executive parking area. Through the windshield, I recognized Daniel Harrison sitting in the back seat. Our eyes met for only a brief second before the car continued toward the exit. He gave the slightest nod, almost impossible to notice unless someone had been looking directly at him. I drove home wondering whether that simple gesture meant anything at all, unaware that the most important test of my career had already begun. The strongest leaders are rarely the loudest people in the room. They are usually the ones quietly solving problems before anyone realizes a crisis ever existed. I did not know it then, but the days following my meeting with Daniel Harrison would become the most carefully observed period of my career. Nothing about my schedule changed on the surface. Every morning I arrived before most employees, reviewed overnight production reports, walked through each department, and spoke with supervisors about anything that might slow production or create unnecessary pressure on the team. If someone had asked me whether my life felt different, I would have answered no. Yet somewhere in the back of my mind, I remembered Mr. Harrison's words. "Continue doing your work exactly as you always have." That sentence became surprisingly easy to follow because I had never built my career around impressing executives. I had built it around helping people do their jobs more effectively. One Tuesday morning, our customer service department informed me that one of our largest clients had received 2 shipments with incorrect product configurations. The mistake had already frustrated the customer, and another delay could place a multi-million-dollar contract at risk. Rather than calling an emergency meeting filled with accusations, I gathered representatives from production, quality assurance, inventory, and shipping around a conference table. "Nobody is here to assign blame," I said. "We are here to understand what happened and make sure it never happens again." The atmosphere changed immediately. Instead of defending themselves, people began sharing information openly. Within an hour, we discovered that 2 nearly identical product labels had caused experienced employees to scan the wrong inventory during peak production hours. The problem was not carelessness. The system itself had invited confusion. We redesigned the labeling process before lunch, tested it that afternoon, and prevented the issue from happening again. Before everyone left the room, I thanked each department for working together instead of protecting individual reputations. As I walked back toward my office, I noticed Melissa Grant standing near the end of the hallway speaking quietly with the Vice President of Operations. She smiled politely when she saw me before continuing her conversation. It was probably nothing unusual, Yet I could not ignore the feeling that the executive office remained interested in how ordinary days unfolded across the company. Later that week, another challenge appeared. Two experienced department supervisors strongly disagreed over staffing assignments for a new production line. Their disagreement had gradually spread through their teams, creating unnecessary tension that threatened productivity. Instead of making the decision myself, I invited both supervisors into my office and asked each of them to explain not only what they wanted, but why they believed it would benefit the employees under their responsibility. As they spoke, it became clear that neither man was trying to gain personal advantage. They simply viewed the problem from different perspectives. After nearly 45 minutes of discussion, they began suggesting compromises to one another without any encouragement from me. By the end of the meeting, they shook hands and left with a solution they had built together. One of them smiled before walking out. "Thank you for listening instead of deciding for us," he said. I smiled. People usually support solutions they help create. That simple conversation stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. Leadership, I had learned over the years, was not about proving you had the best answer. It was about helping others discover the best answer together. Several days later, I was reviewing production schedules when an unexpected visitor appeared outside my office. It was Daniel Harrison. He was not wearing a suit this time. Instead, he had on a company polo shirt and safety glasses, making him look almost like any other employee walking through the manufacturing floor. Several workers greeted him politely before returning to their tasks without creating unnecessary excitement. He stepped into my office with an easy smile. "Do you have a few minutes?" he asked. "Of course," I replied. Rather than discussing company strategy, he asked if I would join him for a walk through the facility. We spent nearly an hour speaking with machine operators, warehouse employees, maintenance technicians, and quality inspectors. Daniel rarely asked about financial performance. Instead, he asked people what made their jobs easier, what frustrated them most, and whether they felt supported by management. I answered questions only when someone addressed me directly. Otherwise, I listened. As we finished the tour, Daniel stopped beside one of the production lines where employees were preparing an important customer order. He quietly watched the team for several minutes before turning toward me. "Do you notice something?" he asked. I looked across the floor. Employees communicated naturally. Supervisors moved between workstations offering assistance instead of criticism. Problems were discussed openly without anyone raising their voice. "People trust each other," I answered. Daniel nodded. "Exactly." He remained silent for another moment before continuing. "Many executives believe culture comes from speeches. It does not. It comes from thousands of small interactions repeated every single day." We walked toward the exit together. Before leaving, he thanked several employees individually for their work, calling each person by name. I realized then why so many people respected him. His attention extended far beyond boardrooms and financial reports. As we reached the lobby, he turned toward me. "You handled the customer issue well earlier this week." I looked at him with mild surprise. "You knew about that?" He smiled. "I know far more about this company than most people imagine." Before stepping outside, he paused one final time. "The next few weeks will become even more important, Ethan. Continue leading exactly the way you have been. Do not change anything simply because you know I am paying attention." After he left, I stood in the lobby for several moments reflecting on our conversation. I still had no idea where any of this was leading. There had been no discussion of promotions, no promises, and no explanation beyond his continued interest in how I approached leadership. Yet something inside me told me this process was building toward a decision much larger than I could currently see. I returned to my office, opened the next production report, and focused once again on the ordinary responsibilities that had quietly shaped my entire career, unaware that the most difficult test had not yet arrived. The true measure of leadership is revealed when solving the hardest problem offers no guarantee that anyone will ever know your name. About 2 weeks after my second conversation with Daniel Harrison, the company entered one of the busiest production periods of the year. Several major customers had placed overlapping orders. Every production line was operating near capacity, and even a small disruption could affect delivery schedules across multiple states. Everyone understood the importance of staying focused. The atmosphere was busy but steady, exactly the kind of challenge our teams usually handled well because we trusted one another. Then, early on a Wednesday morning, A transportation company notified us that severe weather in another region had delayed several trucks carrying specialized components we needed for one of our largest contracts. Without those parts, an entire production line would stop within 24 hours. The financial consequences could be significant, but what concerned me even more was the possibility of disappointing a customer who had trusted our company for years. Within minutes, department managers began calling my office asking what we should do. Instead of rushing toward the warehouse, I asked everyone to meet in the main conference room. As familiar faces gathered around the table, I noticed the same concern on every face. Purchasing blamed transportation delays. Logistics worried about scheduling. Production feared idle employees. Customer service prepared for difficult conversations with clients. I waited until everyone had spoken before saying a single sentence. Let us solve the problem before we discuss the cause. The room immediately became quieter. We spread production schedules across the table, reviewed inventory levels, examined every pending order, and looked for creative ways to reorganize our workflow. One supervisor suggested moving a lower priority order to another production line. Another proposed borrowing limited inventory from a nearby distribution center until the delayed shipment arrived. A warehouse coordinator identified materials that could be prepared in advance, allowing final assembly to move much faster once the missing components reached our facility. Every idea built upon the previous one. Instead of watching departments compete for resources, I watched experienced professionals work together because everyone understood the same objective. By lunchtime, we had developed a completely revised production schedule that protected every critical customer deadline without asking employees to work unreasonable hours. It was not a perfect solution, but it was practical, respectful, and achievable. Before everyone left the room, I thanked each person individually for contributing rather than defending their own department. One younger supervisor smiled and said, "Meetings always feel different when people know they will actually be heard." That comment stayed with me long after the room emptied. During the afternoon, I walked across the production floor checking on each department personally. Rather than issuing instructions, I asked employees whether they had everything they needed to succeed under the revised schedule. Several operators suggested small improvements that made the plan even stronger. I made notes, thanked them, and immediately shared their ideas with the appropriate managers. Good ideas did not become more valuable because they came from executives. They became valuable because they solved real problems. Later that day, while passing through the employee cafeteria, I noticed Daniel Harrison sitting alone near the window with nothing more than a cup of coffee and a notebook. He was dressed casually once again, blending naturally into the workplace instead of drawing attention to himself. He looked up as I entered and motioned toward the empty chair across from him. "How is the revised schedule working?" he asked before I even sat down. I smiled slightly. "Better than I expected. The team improved it far beyond my original plan." He nodded with obvious satisfaction. "That answer tells me more than you probably realize." I looked at him curiously. "Because you gave them credit?" he asked. "Because they earned it," I replied. "The schedule only worked because everyone contributed." Daniel folded his hands thoughtfully. "Many managers believe leadership means always having the right answer. The strongest leaders understand that their real responsibility is creating an environment where the best answers can emerge from anyone." We spoke for another 15 minutes. Not about financial results or executive strategy, but about people. He asked how I handled disagreements, what qualities I looked for when promoting supervisors, and why employee retention remained unusually high within the departments I supported. I answered honestly. I told him I believed people performed their best when they felt respected, informed, and trusted to solve meaningful problems. Before leaving the cafeteria, he said something I would remember for years. Character becomes visible during ordinary days long before it is tested during extraordinary ones. After he walked away, I returned to work without giving our conversation much additional thought. By Friday afternoon, every shipment had left on time despite the earlier delays. The customer never realized how close we had come to missing the deadline, and I considered that the best possible outcome. Success in operations often meant preventing problems quietly enough that nobody outside the company ever knew they existed. Near the end of the day, Melissa Grant called my office. "Mr. Brooks," she said warmly, "Mr. Harrison would like you to attend a special leadership meeting at headquarters next Friday morning." Formal invitations will be distributed later this week, but he asked me to notify you personally so you could reserve the time. I thanked her and wrote the date on my calendar. May I ask what the meeting is about? I said. She paused for just a moment before answering. I am afraid I cannot discuss the agenda. Mr. Harrison would prefer everyone hear the announcement together. After the call ended, I looked at the calendar on my desk for several quiet moments. A leadership meeting involving executives from across the company was highly unusual, especially one surrounded by this much discretion. I still had no explanation for why I had been included, but something told me that whatever Daniel Harrison had been quietly evaluating over the past several weeks was finally approaching its conclusion. The longer uncertainty lasts, the more revealing every ordinary conversation becomes. During the week leading up to the leadership meeting, I continued my routine exactly as Daniel Harrison had requested. I arrived before sunrise, walked the production floor with a cup of coffee in my hand, greeted employees by name, and reviewed overnight reports before the first management meeting of the day. Nothing about my responsibilities felt different, yet I could sense a quiet anticipation throughout the executive offices. Melissa Grant remained professional as always, but every time we crossed paths, she offered the same reassuring smile, without revealing a single detail. Whatever was coming had been planned carefully, and only a handful of people seemed to know the full story. I reminded myself that speculation would accomplish nothing. The only thing I could control was the quality of the work in front of me. Late Wednesday afternoon, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed my father's number. "Hello, Dad," I answered. "How are things?" he asked casually. "Busy but good." He laughed. "Busy is not always the same as successful, son." I smiled to myself because the conversation already felt familiar. "Everything is running smoothly at work." "Still keeping that company organized?" he asked. "Yes. I suppose somebody has to do it. I still think you could have aimed much higher." His words were not spoken with anger. They were simply the reflection of a belief he had carried for years. In his mind, leadership belonged to people whose names appeared in magazines or whose offices occupied the top floor of a building. The thousands of decisions that quietly kept an organization functioning had little value because they happened outside the spotlight. "I appreciate your concern," I replied calmly. "I am exactly where I need to be right now." He sighed gently. "I only want you to reach your potential." "I know, Dad." After we ended the call, I sat quietly for a moment before returning to work. Surprisingly, I no longer felt the need to defend my choices. Daniel Harrison had reminded me that genuine value did not depend upon constant recognition. That realization made my father's criticism easier to hear without allowing it to shape my confidence. Thursday morning brought another opportunity to practice that philosophy. A newly promoted supervisor approached my office looking frustrated after a difficult conversation with one of his team members. He admitted he was considering issuing a formal warning because the employee had challenged one of his decisions during a shift meeting. Rather than immediately discussing company policy, I invited him to describe the entire situation from beginning to end. As he spoke, it became clear that the employee had not been disrespectful. He had simply suggested an alternative process that could reduce wasted materials. The supervisor had interpreted the suggestion as public criticism because he was still adjusting to his new leadership role. "Do you think he wanted to embarrass you?" I asked. The supervisor thought for several seconds before shaking his head. "No, I think he genuinely believed the idea would help." "Then start there," I said. "Leadership becomes much easier when you assume good intentions before bad ones." He smiled with visible relief. The following afternoon, he returned to my office carrying 2 cups of coffee. He told me he had met with the employee privately, listened to the proposal, and discovered it would reduce production waste by nearly 4% over the next quarter. Instead of writing a disciplinary report, they had worked together to improve the process. "Thank you," he said. "I almost solved the wrong problem." After he left, I realized once again that the most meaningful victories rarely appeared on financial statements. They happened quietly through conversations that allowed people to grow. Friday finally arrived. I drove to corporate headquarters earlier than requested, wearing the same navy suit I reserved for important meetings. The headquarters building overlooked downtown Columbus, its glass exterior reflecting the bright morning sky. As I entered the lobby, I immediately noticed far more senior executives than usual. Vice presidents, regional directors, and division leaders greeted one another as they waited near the elevators. Many of them had decades of executive experience. I recognized several faces from annual leadership conferences, but had never spoken with most of them personally. Seeing them gathered together made me question once again whether I truly belonged there. One executive smiled politely as we waited for the elevator. "Operations?" he asked after noticing my identification badge. "Yes," I answered. "Good department," he said. "You keep the rest of us from making promises we cannot deliver." I laughed softly. "We do our best." We rode to the executive conference level in comfortable silence. Outside the boardroom, staff members greeted arriving guests and directed everyone toward assigned seats. I noticed printed name cards arranged around an enormous conference table, but before I had time to find mine, Melissa Grant approached me. "Good morning, Ethan," she said warmly. "Mr. Harrison asked that you wait with me for just a few moments before entering." I followed her into a smaller conference room overlooking the city skyline. Daniel Harrison stood near the window, reviewing several documents before placing them neatly inside a leather portfolio. When he saw me, he smiled with the same calm confidence he had displayed during every previous conversation. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I appreciate your patience over the past few weeks." "I still have no idea why I am here," I admitted honestly. He nodded. "I know." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he stepped closer and looked directly at me. "Everything you have done since our first meeting has confirmed exactly what I hoped to see. You never changed your behavior because you believed someone important was watching. You continued serving people, solving problems, and giving credit to others exactly as you always have." I thanked him quietly, unsure where the conversation was leading. He placed one hand gently on my shoulder. "In a few minutes we are going to walk into that boardroom together. I only have one request." "What is that?" I asked. His expression remained steady. "No matter what happens today, remain the same person who walked through our factory every morning before sunrise. That is the person this company needs most." Before I could ask another question, a soft knock sounded at the door. Melissa opened it slightly and smiled. "Mr. Harrison, everyone has arrived. They are ready to begin." Daniel picked up his portfolio, looked at me one final time, and simply said, "Then it is time." Edit. The room became completely silent as Daniel Harrison and I walked through the doors of the executive boardroom together. More than 100 senior leaders from across the company were already seated. Regional vice presidents, division directors, plant managers, and members of the board of directors filled every chair. I quietly found my assigned seat near the middle of the room, still convinced I had simply been invited to observe an important corporate announcement. Daniel walked confidently to the front of the room, thanked everyone for attending, and waited until every conversation had ended before speaking. "Good morning, everyone," he began. "For more than 30 years, this company has grown because extraordinary people chose to place long-term values ahead of short-term recognition. Every person in this room has contributed to that success, and I am deeply grateful." He paused, allowing his words to settle across the room. "Today, I would like to discuss the future of our leadership." Several executives exchanged quick glances. The atmosphere immediately became more serious. Rumors about executive succession had circulated quietly for months, but nobody seemed certain what Daniel intended to announce. He continued with remarkable calm. "Over the past year, I have spent a great deal of time evaluating what this company will require over the next decade. Technology will continue changing. Markets will continue evolving. Customer expectations will continue rising. None of those challenges concern me nearly as much as one question: who can preserve the culture that built this organization in the first place?" A large presentation screen illuminated behind him, displaying photographs from throughout the company's history. Some images showed the first manufacturing facility. Others captured longtime employees celebrating retirement after decades of service. Daniel slowly walked across the stage while speaking. "Many organizations believe their greatest asset is equipment, intellectual property, or financial strength. I disagree. Our greatest advantage has always been trust. Trust between employees, trust between departments, trust between leadership and the people who arrive every morning ready to build something meaningful together." The room remained completely silent. Every executive appeared focused on his next sentence. "During the past several months," Daniel continued, "I have quietly observed leaders throughout every level of this company. Not during formal presentations. Not during quarterly reviews. I watched how they behaved during ordinary workdays. I watched how they handled unexpected problems. I watched how they treated people who could do nothing for their careers. My heartbeat gradually became louder inside my own thoughts. His words sounded remarkably familiar. Some leaders seek recognition before earning respect, he said. Others earn respect long before anyone notices. He stepped away from the podium and looked across the audience. I have reached my decision. Several executives instinctively straightened in their seats. The board members watched silently. Daniel smiled gently before speaking again. The next leader of this company will not be selected because of the loudest presentation, the most impressive title, or the strongest political influence. The future of this organization belongs to someone who has already been leading without asking anyone to notice. He turned toward the audience. Ethan Brooks, would you please join me on stage? For a brief moment, I honestly believed I had misunderstood my own name. Then dozens of heads slowly turned toward my seat. Complete silence filled the room. I stood carefully, still uncertain whether I belonged at the front of the room, and walked toward the stage while trying to understand what was happening. Daniel welcomed me with a warm handshake before facing the audience. Once again, many of you know Ethan as our senior operations manager, he said. What many of you do not know is that over the past 8 years, he has quietly become one of the strongest examples of servant leadership I have ever witnessed. The large screen behind us changed to photographs of production teams, warehouse employees, and cross-departmental meetings. None of the pictures focused on me. Instead, they showed ordinary employees working together. Daniel continued. When departments struggled to cooperate, Ethan built trust instead of assigning blame. When production problems threatened customer relationships, he united people around solutions rather than protecting individual reputations. When projects succeeded, he consistently gave credit to the people beside him instead of claiming it for himself. I looked across the audience and recognized several department managers who had participated in those moments. Many of them smiled with quiet encouragement. Daniel continued speaking. Over the past several months, I intentionally created opportunities to observe Ethan under increasing responsibility without informing him that he was being evaluated. His behavior never changed. Whether speaking with machine operators, warehouse staff, supervisors, or executives, he demonstrated the same respect, patience, and steady judgment every single day. He paused before delivering the announcement that changed my life forever. Effective immediately, I am asking the board of directors to confirm Ethan Brooks as the next chief executive officer of this company following my planned retirement transition. For one extraordinary second, the room remained completely still, almost as though everyone needed time to process what they had just heard. Then applause began near the front of the room before spreading throughout the audience until nearly every executive was standing. I looked across the room in disbelief, overwhelmed not by the promotion itself, but by the realization that years of quiet work had been seen after all. Daniel waited until the applause softened before placing one hand on my shoulder. Titles do not create leaders, he said. They simply reveal the people who have already been leading all along. He then stepped slightly aside and smiled toward me. Ethan, these people deserve to hear from you. Please tell them what kind of company you intend to help build. For several seconds, I simply stood there looking across the room, trying to absorb what had just happened. The applause slowly faded, but the warmth behind it remained. I took a slow breath, stepped toward the podium, and looked at the faces of the people who had spent years building this company together. Some were experienced executives who had guided entire divisions for decades. Others were younger leaders beginning the next chapter of their careers. Every one of them deserved honesty more than polished words. Thank you, I began. I never expected to stand here today, and I certainly never spent my career trying to reach this stage. I believe my responsibility was much simpler than that. Every morning, I came to work hoping to leave this company a little stronger than I found it the day before. The room remained completely still. I have learned that leadership is not about being the smartest person in the room. It is about creating a room where everyone feels comfortable sharing their best ideas. Some of the most valuable improvements I have ever seen came from people whose names never appeared in reports or presentations. They came from machine operators who noticed small details, warehouse employees who found better ways to organize inventory, supervisors who chose cooperation over competition, and teams that trusted one another enough to solve problems together. I paused briefly before continuing. If I accept this responsibility, I will never ask anyone to work harder than I am willing to work myself. I will never believe that a title makes one person's ideas more valuable than another's. Every employee who walks through our doors deserves respect because every role contributes to our success. I looked toward Daniel Harrison. Mr. Harrison taught me something during the past several weeks without ever saying it directly. Character is not measured during extraordinary moments. It is revealed through ordinary choices repeated every single day. I intend to protect that lesson for as long as I have the privilege of serving this company. When I finished speaking, another round of applause filled the room. It felt different from the first. The earlier applause had been surprise. This time it felt like encouragement. As the meeting concluded, dozens of executives approached to introduce themselves personally. Several congratulated me, but what surprised me most was how many spoke about the company culture rather than the promotion itself. One regional director smiled and said, "Daniel has been telling us for years that the future leader would probably surprise everyone. I think now we understand what he meant." Another executive shook my hand and laughed softly. "You have probably solved problems for my division without me ever realizing who deserved the credit." I smiled. The problems getting solved has always been more important than who received recognition. He nodded with genuine respect. Throughout the afternoon, I found myself having conversations with leaders from every part of the organization. We discussed employee development, manufacturing improvements, customer relationships, and long-term planning. Nobody treated me like a stranger. Instead, they treated me like someone who had quietly been part of the same mission all along. Before leaving headquarters, Daniel invited me into his office one final time. He closed the door, removed his suit jacket, and sat comfortably across from me. "How are you feeling?" he asked. I smiled honestly. "Grateful. A little overwhelmed. Mostly grateful." He nodded. "That is probably the healthiest answer you could give." He opened a drawer and removed a worn leather notebook with several pages marked by colorful tabs. "I have carried this notebook for almost 15 years, he said as he handed it to me. Inside were handwritten observations about leadership, employee conversations, difficult decisions, and lessons learned throughout his career. Some entries were only a few sentences long. Others filled several pages. "I started writing these notes because I realized memory is imperfect," he explained. "Whenever I made a mistake, I wrote down what I learned. Whenever an employee taught me something important, I wrote that down too." I carefully turned another page. "You are giving this to me?" He smiled. "No, I am lending it to you. I expect you to return it one day after adding your own lessons." We both laughed quietly. Then his expression became thoughtful again. "There is something else you should know. Many people will believe today's decision happened because of the past few weeks. They will be wrong. I began noticing your work years ago. Every time I asked senior leaders who quietly solved difficult problems without creating unnecessary conflict, your name appeared. Every time I reviewed employee engagement reports, the departments connected to your leadership consistently ranked among the strongest. I simply needed to confirm that your character remained the same when you knew the chief executive officer was paying attention." I looked down at the notebook resting in my hands. "I never changed because I did not know how to become someone else." Daniel smiled warmly. "Exactly. That is why you are ready." As I drove home later that evening, my phone remained unusually quiet. The official announcement had not yet been released outside the leadership meeting, and I appreciated those few remaining hours of privacy. I stopped briefly at a neighborhood grocery store to pick up dinner, smiling politely at people who had no idea my life had changed that morning. It reminded me that the most important parts of life often continued exactly as before, regardless of titles or promotions. When I arrived home, I placed Daniel's notebook carefully on my kitchen table and sat beside it for several minutes without opening it again. Then my phone vibrated. The screen displayed my father's name. I stared at it for a moment before answering, unaware that by the time our next conversation ended, the relationship that had shaped so much of my life was about to change forever. When I answered the phone, I expected another ordinary conversation. Instead, I immediately noticed something unfamiliar in my father's voice. The confidence that usually accompanied every opinion had been replaced by quiet hesitation. "Ethan," he said, slowly, "are you home?" "Yes." There was a brief pause before he continued. "Your mother and I were wondering if we could stop by this evening." There is something I think I need to say in person. I looked at the clock. It was just after 6 in the evening. Of course, I answered. Come over whenever you are ready. About 40 minutes later, I heard a knock at the front door. My parents stood outside together. My mother smiled gently, but my father looked unusually uncomfortable, almost as though he had rehearsed the conversation during the entire drive. I welcomed them inside and offered coffee. We settled around the small dining table in my apartment, the same table where they had visited several times over the years without ever truly asking about the work that filled most of my life. For several moments, nobody spoke. Finally, my father placed his coffee cup on the table and looked directly at me. I found out what happened today, he said quietly. I nodded. The company released the announcement this afternoon. He slowly shook his head. One of my friends sent me the news article before I even saw the official announcement. I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. His voice carried none of the humor I had heard so many times before. I read it 3 times. My mother reached over and gently touched his arm. Richard wanted to come as soon as we heard. My father took a slow breath. I spent years believing I understood what success looked like. I thought important people always made certain everyone knew how important they were. I thought impressive titles created impressive leaders. He looked around my apartment before returning his attention to me. Today I realized I never bothered to understand the work you were actually doing. I listened quietly without interrupting. There was no anger left inside me, only curiosity. He continued, speaking more slowly than I had ever heard before. When I called your career pathetic at my birthday dinner, I believed I was motivating you to reach higher. Looking back now, I realize I was measuring your life with the wrong standard. The room became completely silent. Finally, he looked me directly in the eyes. I am sorry, Ethan. I was wrong. Those 4 words carried more weight than I ever expected. My father had never been an unkind man, but admitting he had made a mistake did not come naturally to him. I understood how difficult those words must have been to say. I smiled gently. Thank you, Dad. He looked surprised that my response came so quickly. You are not angry? He asked. I was disappointed sometimes, I answered honestly. But I always knew you wanted what you believed was best for me. We simply defined success differently. He nodded slowly. I wish I had asked more questions instead of making more assumptions. My mother smiled with visible relief. I have been hoping the 2 of you would have this conversation for years. My father laughed softly for the first time that evening. Your mother told me many times that I should spend less time giving advice and more time listening. We all laughed together, and the tension that had filled the room slowly disappeared. After a few moments, he leaned back in his chair. Would you tell me something? He asked. Anything. When did the chief executive officer first notice you? I smiled because the answer surprised even me. Years ago, apparently. I did not know until recently. He told me he had been watching how I treated people long before I ever met him personally. My father remained quiet for several seconds before speaking again. So while I was worrying that you were invisible, someone important had already been paying attention. Yes, I replied. Just not in the way either of us expected. He slowly smiled. That is a lesson I needed to learn. We spent the next 2 hours talking about my work in greater detail than we ever had before. I explained how operations connected every department inside the company, how small improvements could save thousands of hours across an entire year, and why I believed helping other people succeed had always been the most rewarding part of my career. Instead of offering opinions, my father simply listened. Occasionally, he asked thoughtful questions. Occasionally, he laughed when I shared stories about unexpected challenges or creative employee solutions. For the first time, I felt as though he truly saw the life I had built rather than the one he had imagined for me. Before leaving, he stood near the front door and looked around my apartment once more. I used to think leadership meant standing in front of everyone, he said quietly. Now I realize it often begins by standing beside people instead. I smiled. Daniel Harrison taught me something similar. My father extended his hand toward me, then changed his mind and pulled me into a warm embrace instead. I am proud of you, son, he said. Not because you are becoming chief executive officer. I am proud because you became the kind of man who earned that responsibility before anyone ever gave you the title. As they drove away, I stood on the front porch watching the taillights disappear down the quiet street. The promotion had changed my career, but that conversation had changed something much more important. For the first time in many years, I felt that my father no longer admired an imaginary version of success. He finally understood the person I had quietly become all along. 3 years passed more quickly than I ever imagined. Looking back, the promotion itself was never the most important part of the story. The real challenge began the day after the announcement, when I walked into the office carrying a new title but determined not to let it change the way I treated people. On my first morning as Chief Executive Officer, I arrived before sunrise exactly as I always had. The security guard smiled when he saw me walking toward the entrance with a cup of coffee in my hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Brooks," he said. I smiled back. "Thank you, James. And please keep calling me Ethan." He laughed. "I had a feeling you would say that." Some habits never changed. I still walk through the production floor every morning before attending executive meetings. I still stopped to ask employees how their families were doing. I still listened to machine operators before reviewing reports because I had learned years earlier that the people closest to the work usually noticed important problems first. Gradually, those small routines became part of the company's culture. Managers throughout the organization began spending more time on the factory floor instead of remaining inside conference rooms. Departments that had once competed for recognition started sharing ideas more openly. Employee retention improved year after year, customer satisfaction reached record levels, and productivity increased without asking people to sacrifice their personal lives. None of those improvements happened because of a single speech or one dramatic decision. They happened because hundreds of people chose every day to treat one another with respect. Daniel Harrison officially retired several months after the leadership transition. Before leaving, he handed me the same leather notebook he had once loaned to me. Inside the final page, he had written one short sentence beneath his signature. "The company will never become greater than the character of the people who lead it." I added my own note beneath his. "Leadership begins by making someone else's day easier than it would have been without you." Then I returned the notebook to his office exactly as I had promised. He smiled after reading my words and quietly closed the cover. "Now it belongs to the next generation," he said. Even after retirement, Daniel occasionally visited the company for lunch with longtime employees. He never interfered with decisions or offered advice unless someone specifically asked. His greatest lesson remained the example he had already lived. My relationship with my parents changed just as dramatically. My father no longer measured success by titles alone. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions about the people I worked with, the improvements our teams were making, and the challenges that came with leading a growing organization. During family dinners, he often shared stories about the company with genuine pride, not because his son had become chief executive officer, but because he understood how that responsibility had been earned. One evening, he smiled across the dinner table and laughed softly. "Do you remember what I said at my birthday party?" I smiled. "I remember." He shook his head with an embarrassed grin. "I wish I could erase that conversation." "You do not need to," I answered. "Without it, neither of us would appreciate how much we have both changed." He nodded slowly before raising his glass. To listening before judging. Everyone around the table smiled and raised their glasses with him. Olivia later admitted that watching our relationship heal had become one of the happiest experiences our family had shared in years. My mother quietly confessed that she had prayed for that conversation long before it finally happened. She liked to remind us that people grow most when they are willing to admit they still have something to learn. As the company continued expanding, several business publications invited me to speak about leadership. Journalists often asked what management philosophy had produced such strong employee loyalty. They usually expected complicated strategies or impressive business theories. Instead, I always gave the same answer. Respect people before they prove their value to you, because most people become their best when someone believes in them first. Some interviewers looked surprised by such a simple response. Others smiled because they understood exactly what I meant. Years after becoming chief executive officer, I occasionally thought back to the evening when my father had called my career pathetic. The memory no longer carried any pain. Instead, it reminded me how easily people can misunderstand quiet success. Not every meaningful career attracts attention in the beginning. Not every capable leader announces their potential. Sometimes the strongest foundations are built so gradually that others mistake patience for a lack of ambition. If I had spent those years trying to prove my father wrong, I probably would have missed the opportunity to become the leader Daniel Harrison believed I could be. Instead, I focused on doing ordinary work with extraordinary consistency, trusting that character always leaves a trail for the right people to notice. Looking back now, I realized the greatest victory was never becoming the chief executive officer. The greatest victory was discovering that genuine success never required me to become someone different from the person I had quietly chosen to be all along. Titles can open doors, promotions can change careers, and recognition can change public opinion, but none of those things define a person's true worth. Character does. The way we treat people when nobody is watching does. The willingness to solve problems without demanding applause does. That is the lesson I hope every person who hears my story remembers long after the details have faded. The people who underestimate you may eventually change their minds, or they may not. Either way, your future should never depend upon their approval. Build your life with integrity. Serve others with humility. Remain faithful to your values during ordinary days, and trust that the right opportunities will arrive when your character is ready to carry them. In the end, the loudest proof of success is not found in the title printed on a business card. It is found in the quiet respect you earn from the people whose lives become better because you chose to lead with kindness, consistency, and unwavering character.